In 1862, 22 out of 48 soldiers died in a deadly ambush at Redwood Ferry, tricked by a false promise of peace. Dakota leader White Dog, wearing a beaded shirt and holding a rifle, stood with women and children to draw Captain John Marsh across the Minnesota River. A hidden warrior's shot started a massacre, killing interpreter Peter Quinn instantly, and Marsh, in his blue uniform, drowned while escaping. Historian Kenneth Carley, in the Dakota War of 1862, says 50 Dakota warriors set the trap, leaving Fort Ridgely with only 30 soldiers to defend it. Why did the Dakota resort to this desperate plan, and could trust have stopped this bloodshed? Watch to find out. The Lower Sioux Agency stood as a vital hub along the Minnesota River Valley, its wooden buildings and trading stores bustling with activity. Settlers and traders moved through their daily routines, unaware of the gathering storm. By 1862, the agency served as a critical point of contact between the U.S. government and the Dakota people, managing annuities and trade under treaties like the 1851 Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. Yet, as historian Gary Clayton Anderson notes in Through Dakota Eyes, the agency had become a symbol of exploitation, with traders hoarding profits while Dakota families faced starvation. The calm of that summer morning belied the tensions simmering just beyond the agency's walls, tensions that would soon erupt with devastating force. The Dakota people teetered on the brink of survival, their communities ravaged by hunger and betrayal. The U.S. government's failure to deliver promised annuities, payments meant to compensate for ceded lands, left thousands without resources. In the summer of 1862, an estimated 7,000 Dakota lived on a narrow reservation along the Minnesota River, their traditional hunting grounds reduced to a fraction of their former extent. Historian Benjamin Madley, in An American Genocide, highlights how delayed annuity payments, often siphoned off by corrupt officials, forced the Dakota into dependence on agency traders. These traders, in turn, demanded exorbitant prices or outright refused credit, leaving families to face famine. The Dakota's anger grew, rooted in a profound sense of injustice. 4 young Dakota warriors, driven by this desperation, ventured near Acton Township, about 40 miles from the agency. Clad in traditional breechcloths and carrying rifles, they sought food after being turned away by traders at the agency. On the 17th of August, 1862, their hunger collided with opportunity when they encountered a small group of settlers. The exact trigger remains debated, but as Anderson recounts, the warriors' frustration with the agency's indifference boiled over. They demanded provisions, and when refused, their resentment turned deadly. These young men, likely in their late teens or early 20s, represented a generation caught between tradition and a shrinking world. In a sudden outburst of violence, the warriors killed 5 settlers in Acton Township, 3 men, 1 woman, and a teenage girl. The attack, later dubbed the Acton Massacre, occurred in a matter of minutes, with gunshots echoing across the quiet prairie. The victims, including a farmer named Robinson Jones, were unprepared, their deaths a brutal testament to the Dakota's mounting rage. Historian Kenneth Carley, in the Dakota War of 1862, estimates that the killing sent shockwaves through nearby settlements, amplifying fears of native unrest. For the Dakota, this act was both a release of pent-up fury and a dangerous escalation, one that would demand a response from the U.S. military. The Dakota understood that the Acton killings would provoke swift retribution. The U.S. Army, stationed at nearby Fort Ridgely, had a history of punishing native resistance, as seen in earlier conflicts like the Black Hawk War of 1832. With an estimated 1,500 soldiers in Minnesota by 1862, the military's presence loomed large. The warriors' actions placed the entire Dakota community at risk, forcing their leaders to confront an impossible choice. As Carley notes, The killings closed the door to negotiation, leaving the Dakota to decide between submission to inevitable punishment or defiance through war. This moment marked a turning point, one that would reshape the Minnesota frontier. That night, Dakota leaders gathered at the home of Little Crow, a prominent figure of the Mdewakanton Band. Little Crow, in his late 40s, wore a dark coat and held a staff as he addressed the council, his weathered face reflecting years of diplomacy. Having traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1858 to negotiate treaties, he had seen the vast cities and armies of the United States. Anderson quotes Little Crow's own words, "The white men are like locusts. We cannot fight them." His home, a modest wooden structure near the agency, became the stage for a heated debate. The council, attended by dozens of warriors and elders, weighed the consequences of the Acton killings against the survival of their people. Little Crow's voice carried the weight of experience as he urged caution. He warned that war with the U.S. would lead to ruin, citing the overwhelming strength of the American military, which boasted over 600,000 troops nationwide by 1862. His travels had shown him the industrial might of the East, from railroads to factories, resources the Dakota could not match. Yet, as historian Roy Meyer details in History of the Santee Sioux, Little Crow faced immense pressure from younger warriors who saw no future in enduring starvation and humiliation. His plea for restraint clashed with the raw anger of a people pushed to the edge, creating a rift that would define the night's outcome. Despite his warnings, Little Crow bowed to the will of his people. The council's decision was driven by the Acton killings and the broader context of betrayal, as traders like Andrew Merrick amassed wealth while Dakota children went hungry. With blood already spilled, retreat was no longer an option. Little Crow, gripping his rifle, agreed to lead the war, a choice Meyer describes as a reluctant surrender to the inevitable. His leadership, though born of necessity, united the Dakota in a desperate bid to reclaim their dignity. By midnight, plans were set, and the warriors prepared to strike at dawn, their resolve hardened by years of broken promises. In the pre-dawn darkness, Dakota warriors moved silently to encircle the lower Sioux agency. Led by Red Middle Voice, Shakopee, Little Crow, and Big Eagle, they numbered around 200, drawn from 4 villages along the reservation. Clad in war paint and armed with rifles and tomahawks, they positioned themselves among the trees and hills, their movements coordinated with precision. Carley notes that the warriors' strategy relied on surprise, targeting the agency's trading stores to seize food and disrupt U.S. control. The quiet of the night masked their approach as the agency's residents slept, unaware of the force gathering just beyond their doors. As the first rays of sunlight touched the Minnesota River, gunfire shattered the morning calm. The Dakota warriors surged forward, their rifles blazing as they stormed the lower Sioux agency. Settlers awoke to a scene of chaos. Buildings erupted in flames, and screams filled the air. The attack, launched on the 18th of August, 1862, was swift and relentless, with warriors targeting the 4 trading stores at the agency's heart. Anderson describes the assault as a calculated strike against symbols of oppression, as the Dakota sought to reclaim the resources denied to them. Within minutes, the agency was engulfed in a nightmare of fire and violence, marking the opening salvo of the Dakota War. The Dakota warriors struck at the heart of their suffering, targeting the 4 trading stores that stood as stark symbols of injustice at the lower Sioux agency. These stores, stocked with flour, sugar, and meat, held the resources promised to the Dakota under the 1851 Treaty of Travis-des-Sioux. Yet, traders controlled access, often refusing credit or demanding inflated prices. Historian Gary Clayton Anderson, in Through Dakota Eyes, estimates that by 1862, traders amassed profits equivalent to $200,000 annually, while Dakota families starved. The warriors, wielding rifles and tomahawks, stormed the stores with precision, their attack a direct rebuke to a system that enriched outsiders at their expense. The stores, built of wood and filled with goods, became the first casualties of a war born from betrayal. Among the traitors, Andrew Merrick stood out as a figure of particular contempt. Known for his cruel dismissal of the Dakotas' pleas, he had scoffed, "If they are hungry, let them eat grass," during a tense confrontation earlier that summer. On the 18th of August, 1862, as gunfire erupted, Merrick, a middle-aged man in a linen shirt, scrambled for safety. He climbed through an attic window of his store, his hands gripping the wooden frame as he sought escape. But a Dakota warrior, likely positioned on the hill overlooking the agency, took aim. A single bullet struck Merrick, and he fell dead. Historian Kenneth Carley, in the Dakota War of 1862, calls this moment a personal reckoning, reflecting the Dakotas' deep-seated anger toward those who profited from their misery. Merrick's death carried a grim message. When his body was later discovered amidst the wreckage, his mouth was stuffed with grass, a chilling act of retribution. This gesture, as Anderson notes, was not mere savagery but a deliberate symbol, echoing Merrick's own words back to him. The Dakota, denied food and dignity, used this act to reclaim a measure of justice. The image of Merrick's corpse, lying among the smoldering ruins of his store, underscored the depth of the Dakotas' resolve. It was a stark warning to other traders that their actions bore consequences, a moment that resonated across the frontier as news of the attack spread. James W. Lind, another victim, fell in the opening moments of the assault. A former Minnesota state senator turned clerk at Merrick's store. Lind was in his 40s, his graying hair tucked under a cap as he worked behind the counter. As the warriors charged, a young Dakota fighter, perhaps no older than 20, singled him out. The warrior, gripping a rifle, shouted, "Now I will kill the dog who would not give me credit," before firing. Lind collapsed, his death swift and brutal. Carley reports that Lind's role as a clerk made him a target, as he enforced the traders' policies of withholding goods. His killing reflected the Dakotas' broader grievance. The agency's staff, whether traders or clerks, were complicit in their suffering. By midday, the assault claimed 13 settler lives at the Lower Sioux agency. The victims, primarily store owners and their employees, bore the brunt of the Dakotas' targeted fury. Anderson estimates that of the roughly 50 settlers present, these 13 were killed for their direct roles in the agency's operations. The traders, like Merrick and William Forbes, had built small fortunes, with Forbes's store alone valued at $15,000 in goods. Meanwhile, the Dakota faced famine, with reports of children dying from malnutrition. The precision of the attack, focusing on those who controlled resources, reveals a calculated strategy, not a mindless rampage. The Dakota sought to dismantle the system that starved them, and their success left the agency in ruins. Flames devoured the Lower Sioux agency as the warriors set fire to its buildings. Wooden structures, from trading stores to administrative offices, ignited quickly, sending thick columns of black smoke into the sky. By noon, the agency, which had housed 20 buildings and served as a hub for 7,000 Dakota and 200 settlers, was reduced to ash. Carley describes the scene as a hellish glow, with the crackle of burning timber mingling with the cries of those caught in the chaos. The destruction was total, erasing a physical symbol of U.S. authority. For the Dakota, this act was both practical, seizing stored goods, and symbolic, obliterating a place that had come to represent their oppression. In the midst of the fire and gunfire, settlers fled in terror, their orderly lives shattered. Men, women, and children ran from the burning agency, some clutching blankets or tools as they sought safety. Many headed for the Minnesota River a quarter-mile away, hoping to cross at Redwood Ferry or reach the dense woods beyond. Anderson notes that approximately 30 settlers attempted this escape, but the open prairie offered little cover. Dakota warriors, positioned on horseback or moving swiftly on foot, pursued them relentlessly. The settlers' flight, marked by desperation and fear, underscored the sudden collapse of a frontier they had believed secure. Redwood Ferry, the main crossing point over the Minnesota River, became a scene of slaughter. The ferry, operated by a single boatman named Charles LeBaith, was a narrow wooden platform, capable of carrying only a dozen people at a time. As settlers crowded the riverbank, LeBaith worked frantically, pulling the ferry's rope to shuttle them across. But the Dakota warriors, numbering at least 50 at the crossing, closed in. Carly reports that LeBaith himself was killed, shot while trying to aid the fleeing settlers. The riverbank turned into a killing field, with at least 5 settlers cut down by gunfire or tomahawks as they waited for the ferry or swam the 100-yard Whitty River. The ferry's blood-soaked boards bore witness to the chaos. Dr. Philander Humphrey, the agency's physician, led his family in a desperate bid for safety. Humphrey, a man in his 50s with a gray beard, wore a dark coat as he guided his wife and children away from the burning agency. They traveled several miles, likely on foot, covering rough terrain along the river valley. His wife, weakened by illness, struggled to keep pace. After reaching a point near Beaver Creek, she collapsed, unable to continue. Humphrey, torn between survival and loyalty, chose to stay with her. Anderson recounts that the family rested briefly, hoping for strength to resume their flight. This decision, born of compassion, sealed their fate as the Dakota warriors tracked them down with relentless efficiency. The Humphrey family's end was tragic. Dakota warriors, moving swiftly through the prairie, overtook them before they could move again. Humphrey, his wife, and most of their children were killed, their bodies left on the roadside. Only their 12-year-old son, John, survived, having been sent ahead to fetch water from a nearby stream. Carly estimates that the attack occurred roughly 5 miles from the agency, a distance that speaks to the family's desperate effort to escape. John's survival, as one of only a handful of witnesses, provided a haunting account of the family's final moments. The loss of the Humphreys, respected figures in the community, deepened the settlers' sense of vulnerability, highlighting the war's indiscriminate toll. The violence at the lower Sioux agency spilled into the surrounding countryside, claiming more lives as settlers fled in vain. 7 additional settlers perished in their desperate attempts to escape, cut down by Dakota warriors who pursued them across the open prairie. Historian Kenneth Carly, in the Dakota War of 1862, notes that these deaths occurred within a 10-mile radius of the agency, as families scattered toward the Minnesota River or nearby woods. The victims, ranging from farmers to laborers, had no time to prepare, their homes abandoned as they ran. The Dakota, numbering around 200 in the initial assault, maintained relentless pressure, their knowledge of the terrain giving them a deadly advantage. These killings underscored the war's rapid escalation, transforming the frontier into a battleground where safety was an illusion. Panic swept through Minnesota's southern frontier as news of the agency's destruction spread like wildfire. By midday on the 18th of August, 1862, reports of burning buildings and slain settlers reached farms and towns, triggering a mass exodus. An estimated 500 settlers, from a regional population of about 5,000, fled toward Fort Ridgely, a military outpost 15 miles southeast of the agency. Historian Gary Clayton Anderson, in Through Dakota Eyes, describes the scene as a tide of terror, with families abandoning crops, livestock, and possessions. The fear was palpable, fueled by rumors of Dakota War parties roaming the countryside. For these settlers, Fort Ridgely represented their only hope, a fragile bastion against an uncertain fate. James and Sarah Dickinson, a farming couple in their 30s, were among those caught in the chaos. Living just 3 miles from the agency, they heard distant gunshots echoing through the morning air. James, wearing a worn jacket and clutching a hunting rifle, rushed into their small wooden farmhouse to alert Sarah. She gathered their 2 young children, ages 5 and 7, and packed a small cart with blankets and bread. Carly recounts that the Dickinsons' farm, valued at $1,001, was left behind as they joined a growing stream of refugees. Their journey to Fort Ridgely, a grueling 15-mile trek, was fraught with danger, each step driven by the sound of gunfire growing closer. Their resolve reflected the desperation of countless others fleeing the Dakota's wrath. The Dickinsons' path to safety was marked by horror. As they hurried along the dirt road, their cart rattling over uneven ground, they passed a grim scene. A wrecked wagon lay in a ditch, its contents of clothes and tools scattered across the grass. Nearby, the bodies of a family, likely a husband, wife, and 2 children, bore the marks of a recent attack. Anderson estimates that at least 20 settlers died in similar roadside ambushes that day, their attempts to reach Fort Ridgely thwarted by Dakota warriors on horseback. The sight hardened the Dickinsons' determination, and James urged their horse forward, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. This moment encapsulated the raw fear gripping the frontier. Reverend Samuel Hinman, a missionary at the Lower Sioux Agency, narrowly escaped the initial assault. The man in his 40s, dressed in a black coat and clutching the reins of his buggy, he fled toward the Minnesota River, just 200 yards from the agency. As he raced along the path, he encountered Little Crow standing tall with a rifle in hand. Hinman, who had known Little Crow for years through missionary work, stopped briefly. His voice trembling, he asked, "Crow, what does this mean?" Carly notes that Little Crow's silence was a stark reply, his face unreadable as the chaos unfolded. Hinman spurred his horse onward, reaching Redwood Ferry moments before Dakota warriors arrived. His escape, a rare stroke of fortune amidst the carnage. Hinman's question lingered unanswered, but his survival hinged on split-second timing. The Minnesota River, about 100 yards wide at Redwood Ferry, offered a narrow escape route. Hinman crossed on a small barge, operated by ferryman Charles LeBaith, who continued shuttling settlers until he was killed. Anderson reports that at least 10 settlers escaped via the ferry before it fell to the Dakota, a testament to LeBaith's bravery. Hinman's encounter with Little Crow, a leader torn between diplomacy and war, highlighted the personal connections strained by the conflict. His flight to safety marked him as one of the few agency residents to survive the day's violence. Thomas Ireland, a settler in his late 30s, faced a far graver ordeal. Warned by a neighbor of the Dakota uprising, Ireland gathered his wife and daughters and fled their homestead near Lake Shetek, about 50 miles from the agency. Wearing a wool vest and carrying a rifle, he led his family through dense grass, hoping to reach a nearby settlement. At a small lake, they were ambushed by a group of Dakota warriors led by Lean Bear, a seasoned fighter. Lean Bear, adorned with war paint and holding a tomahawk, taunted Ireland to shoot. Ireland fired, killing Lean Bear instantly, but the other warriors retaliated, shooting Ireland 7 times. Carly describes Ireland's survival as miraculous, as he crawled 20 miles to a safe haven known as Dutch Charlie's in Cottonwood County. Ireland's fate was both heroic and tragic. Left for dead by the warriors, he endured excruciating pain, his body riddled with bullets. Anderson estimates that Ireland's journey took over 24 hours, a grueling testament to his will to survive. Yet, the cost was steep. He remained unaware of his wife and daughter's fates for days, a personal loss that mirrored the war's broader toll. The ambush at Lake Shetek, which claimed at least 15 settler lives, underscored the Dakota's determination to strike beyond the agency. Ireland's story, one of resilience amid despair, became a haunting footnote in the conflict's early hours. George Spencer, a clerk at the William Forbes trading store, survived through an act of mercy. In his early 20s, Spencer wore a white shirt stained with blood from a wound sustained during the agency's assault. As warriors stormed the store, a Dakota fighter, possibly a friend from past interactions, declared Spencer under his protection. Anderson notes that such acts were not uncommon, as some Dakota sought to spare those they knew personally. Spencer, limping and dazed, joined the stream of refugees heading to Fort Ridgely, 15 miles away. His survival, one of only a handful from the agency's staff, highlighted the complex relationships between Dakota and settlers, even in the heat of war. At Fort Ridgely, Captain John Marsh, a seasoned officer, sprang into action. A veteran of the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861, Marsh, in his late 30s, wore a blue uniform as he received reports of the agency's destruction. Standing in the fort's open courtyard, he gripped a saber and summoned 46 soldiers from Company B, 5th Minnesota Infantry, along with interpreter Peter Quinn. Carley estimates that Marsh's force, though small, was well trained, with access to 200 rifles and 3 cannons. News of the attack, delivered by a breathless survivor, painted a dire picture. Homes burned, settlers slaughtered. Marsh, determined to intercept the Dakota, ordered his men to march to Redwood Ferry, setting the stage for a fateful confrontation. Captain John Marsh led his company of 46 soldiers toward Redwood Ferry, their boots kicking up dust on the familiar dirt road from Fort Ridgely. The men, dressed in blue uniforms and carrying Springfield rifles, marched with purpose, unaware they were walking into a deadly trap. On the 18th of August, 1862, the 15-mile route to the Minnesota River was lined with rolling hills and thick woods, terrain the Dakota knew intimately. Historian Kenneth Carley, in the Dakota War of 1862, notes that Marsh, a veteran of the 1861 Battle of Bull Run, believed his small force could handle the Dakota warriors. Yet, the agency's destruction, with 13 settlers killed and buildings burned, signaled a level of coordination Marsh had underestimated. The soldiers' steady pace belied the danger lurking just ahead. Across the Minnesota River, Dakota leader White Dog stood calmly on the far shore, a deceptive figure of peace. Clad in a beaded shirt and holding a rifle, he was joined by a small group of women and children, a traditional Dakota signal that could suggest negotiation. Marsh, standing on the near bank with interpreter Peter Quinn at his side, saw hope in this scene. Historian Gary Clayton Anderson, in Through Dakota Eyes, explains that such displays were often used to lure enemies into vulnerable positions. White Dog's presence, roughly 100 yards across the river, gave Marsh pause but also a flicker of optimism. He believed a parley might avert further bloodshed, a miscalculation rooted in his trust in military protocol. Marsh and Quinn stepped forward to negotiate, their voices carrying over the gentle ripple of the river. Quinn, a seasoned interpreter in his 40s, wore a plain coat and translated Marsh's offer of peace. White Dog listened, his expression unreadable, as he responded with an invitation for Marsh's men to cross the river for counsel. Carley reports that Marsh hesitated, sensing the risk, but ultimately signaled his troops to board the ferry. The wooden barge, operated by a single rope, could carry only 12 men at a time. As the soldiers crossed, rifles at the ready, the scene remained eerily calm. Anderson notes that White Dog's invitation was a calculated ruse, designed to draw the soldiers into a confined space where they could be easily targeted. The calm shattered with a single gunshot from the brush. Within seconds, dozens of Dakota warriors hidden in the dense undergrowth along the riverbank unleashed a torrent of gunfire. An estimated 50 fighters, armed with rifles and shotguns, fired from elevated positions, their bullets tearing through Marsh's exposed company. Peter Quinn fell instantly, struck in the chest during the opening volley. Carley estimates that at least 10 soldiers died in the first minute, their bodies crumpling on the ferry landing. The Dakota's ambush, executed with lethal precision, turned the crossing into a death trap. The soldiers, caught in the open, had no cover, their formation disintegrating under the relentless barrage. Marsh, gripping his saber, shouted for his men to retreat. Realizing the ferry was a killing zone, he ordered them into the Minnesota River, a 100-yard-with-E expanse, with a strong current. Marsh, in his blue uniform now soaked with sweat, dove into the water, swimming desperately toward the opposite shore. But exhaustion and the river's pull proved too much. Halfway across, his muscles seized with a cramp, and he sank beneath the surface. Anderson recounts that Marsh's drowning, witnessed by only a few of his men, marked a devastating blow to the company's morale. Of the 46 soldiers who had marched out, only half would survive the day, their leader lost to the river's depths. Sergeant John Bishop, a weathered soldier in his 30s, took command amidst the chaos. With bullets whistling overhead, he rallied the 24 surviving soldiers, their uniforms torn and faces grim. The retreat to Fort Ridgely, a grueling 15-mile march, was a test of endurance. Dakota warriors, some crossing the river on horseback, pursued, firing sporadically. Carley notes that at least 5 soldiers fell from wounds or exhaustion during the trek, their bodies left along the roadside. Bishop, carrying a rifle and barking orders, kept the group together, reaching the fort by dusk. His leadership, forged in the crucible of defeat, ensured that the survivors returned to fight another day. Fort Ridgely, sprawling across an open plain, was no fortress. Built in 1853 as a supply depot, it lacked stockade walls, trenches, or fortified gates, its 20 wooden and stone buildings scattered vulnerably. With only 30 soldiers remaining after the ambush, the outpost faced a dire threat. Anderson estimates that the fort's garrison, originally 180 men, had been depleted by deployments elsewhere, leaving it ill-prepared for war. The 3 cannons, 12-pounder howitzers, were its only significant defense, capable of firing canister shots, but requiring time to reload. As survivors stumbled through the gates, the fort's weaknesses became painfully clear, a stark contrast to the Dakota's growing momentum. Lieutenant Thomas Gear, a 19-year-old officer with a boyish face, assumed command in Marsh's absence. Dressed in a blue uniform too large for his slight frame, Gear stood in the fort's courtyard, his inexperience evident. He relied heavily on Sergeant Bishop, whose calm authority steadied the shaken troops. Carley describes Gear as untested but determined, thrust into a role that demanded quick decisions. With the Dakota likely to attack, Gear ordered immediate preparations, tasking soldiers to assess the fort's defenses. The outpost, home to just 50 muskets and limited ammunition, faced an uncertain future, its young commander grappling with the weight of leadership. Civilians flooded into Fort Ridgely, swelling its numbers but straining its resources. Families like James and Sarah Dickinson, along with George Spencer, arrived exhausted, their faces etched with fear. Anderson estimates that by nightfall, 150 settlers, including women and children, had sought refuge, doubling the fort's population. The Dickinsons, clutching their 2 children, carried only a small cart of supplies, their farm abandoned. Spencer, his shirt bloodied from a wound, leaned against a wall, grateful for survival. Food stocks, enough for 100 people for a month, now had to feed twice that number, while ammunition, roughly 5,000 musket balls, was rationed tightly. The civilians' arrival brought both hope and pressure, as every hand would be needed to defend the fort. Soldiers and settlers worked frantically to fortify Fort Ridgely, their efforts a desperate bid to transform a depot into a stronghold. Men and women hauled wooden crates, barrels, and overturned wagons to form makeshift barricades around the central buildings. Sandbags, filled with dirt from the courtyard, were stacked against stone walls to shield windows. Civilians, including farmers like James Dickinson, armed themselves with hunting rifles, axes, and pitchforks, while soldiers cleaned the fort's muskets. Carley reports that the defenders prepared 200 sandbags and 50 barricades, a meager defense against a potential assault. As dusk fell, the fort buzzed with activity, its people united by a shared resolve to hold the line against the Dakota's next move. Fort Ridgely's 3 12-pounder howitzers stood as its only true defense, their iron barrels gleaming under the late summer sun. Positioned in the fort's open courtyard, these cannons, manned by trained artillerymen, could fire canister shots, devastating volleys of iron shrapnel effective up to 300 yards. Historian Kenneth Carley, in the Dakota War of 1862, notes that the cannons, acquired in 1855, were the fort's most formidable asset, capable of repelling large assaults if used wisely. Yet, the fort's sprawling layout, with buildings scattered across 20 acres and no stockade walls, left it vulnerable from every angle. Soldiers carefully aimed the howitzers to cover the western and northern approaches, where hills and ravines offered attackers natural cover. The defenders, numbering fewer than 180 including civilians, pinned their hopes on these weapons as night approached. To the defenders' surprise, no attack came that night, or the following day, the 19th of August, 1862. The eerie silence left Fort Ridgely in a state of tense anticipation, as soldiers and settlers braced for an assault that seemed inevitable. Historian Gary Clayton Anderson, in Through Dakota Eyes, suggests that the Dakota, under Little Crow's leadership, likely used this time to regroup and plan a larger offensive, possibly targeting multiple locations to stretch U.S. forces thin. Inside the fort, Lieutenant Thomas Gear paced the courtyard, his youthful face taut with worry. Civilians like Sarah Dickinson clutched their children, while soldiers cleaned rifles, their eyes scanning the horizon. The delay heightened the defenders' dread, each passing hour amplifying the sense of an unseen enemy gathering strength. Instead of striking Fort Ridgely, the Dakota turned their attention to New Ulm, a town of 900 residents located 30 miles from the Lower Sioux Agency. At noon on the 19th of August, approximately 100 Dakota warriors, armed with rifles and shotguns, emerged from the wooded hills above the town. They faced a hastily assembled militia of 50 men, led by Jacob Nix, a local merchant in his 40s who wore a gray coat and carried a hunting rifle. Carley estimates that the militia, equipped with outdated muskets and shotguns, was poorly trained, with many men firing a weapon for the first time. The Dakota advanced steadily, their war cries echoing as they exchanged fire with the defenders. The clash, lasting into the early afternoon, tested New Ulm's resolve, its crude barricades of wagons and crates offering minimal protection. A sudden thunderstorm, with torrential rain and lightning, halted the Dakota's assault on New Ulm. The warriors, caught in the open, retreated to the hills, their attack disrupted by nature's intervention. The town survived, but at a cost. 6 settlers lay dead, and 5 others were wounded, their blood staining the streets. Anderson notes that the storm, a rare August deluge, likely saved New Ulm from greater destruction, as the Dakota lacked the numbers to press the attack in such conditions. The militia, exhausted but relieved, began repairing barricades, aware that the Dakota would return. For the settlers, the storm was a fleeting reprieve, a moment of grace in a war that offered little mercy. The following day, the 20th of August, 1862, Fort Ridgely faced its trial. Nearly 400 Dakota warriors, led by Little Crow, descended from the western hills, their faces painted and rifles raised. Little Crow, in a dark coat and holding a staff, directed the assault, his leadership unifying fighters from multiple villages. Carly estimates that the Dakota force, one of the largest assembled in the war's early days, aimed to overrun the fort and cripple U.S. military presence in the region. The warriors used the terrain to their advantage, darting between ravines and trees to approach within 200 yards. Their war cries, piercing the morning air, sent a chill through the defenders, who scrambled to their positions, knowing the fort's survival hung in the balance. Sergeant John Bishop, his uniform stained with sweat, took charge of the fort's cannons. The first Dakota wave charged from the west, their rifles firing as they closed the distance. Bishop's artillery crews loaded canister shots, and the howitzers roared, sending clouds of shrapnel into the advancing ranks. Anderson reports that the initial volley killed or wounded at least 20 warriors, forcing a temporary retreat. The Dakota regrouped, launching attacks from the north and east, exploiting the fort's open flanks. Bishop, moving between cannon positions, directed precise fire, his voice steady despite the chaos. The cannon's effectiveness, though limited by slow reloading, proved critical, buying the defenders time to repel the relentless assault. The defenders, a mix of 30 soldiers and 150 civilians, held the line with grim determination. Farmers like James Dickinson, gripping hunting rifles, stood alongside women and children who clutched knives and axes inside stone buildings. Many civilians, untrained in combat, fired muskets for the first time, their shots erratic but defiant. Carly describes the scene as a desperate stand, with mothers shielding their children while reloading weapons for the men. The Dakotas' numbers and mobility posed a constant threat, as warriors darted within 50 yards, their bullets splintering wooden barricades. Yet, the defenders' resolve, fueled by the knowledge that surrender was not an option, kept the fort intact through wave after wave of attacks. The Dakota intensified their assault, setting fire to the fort's outer buildings to flush out the defenders. Flames licked at wooden stables and sheds, sending smoke billowing across the courtyard. A group of warriors, using a ravine for cover, reached a small structure and ignited it, hoping to create chaos. Lieutenant Gear, despite his inexperience, acted swiftly, ordering soldiers to douse the flames with buckets of water. Bishop's cannons continued to fire, their shrapnel tearing through Dakota ranks, attempting to breach the perimeter. Anderson estimates that the fort's 5,000 musket balls dwindled to fewer than 2,000 by day's end, a sign of the defenders' precarious position. The Dakotas' persistence, though fierce, met a wall of resistance that refused to break. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the Dakota launched a final desperate charge. From the hills, they stormed forward, their numbers thinned but their resolve unbroken. Bishop's cannons fired one last volley, the shrapnel scattering the attackers and killing at least 10 more, according to Carly. The Dakota, realizing the fort's defenses would not yield that day, retreated into the twilight, their war cries fading. The defenders, exhausted and low on ammunition, stood amid scorched buildings and fallen comrades. The battle, lasting nearly 8 hours, left Fort Ridgely battered but standing, a testament to the unlikely coalition of soldiers and settlers who held the line against overwhelming odds. The victory at Fort Ridgely came at a steep cost. Buildings bore the scars of fire and bullets, and bodies of both defenders and Dakota warriors lay where they fell. Carly estimates that the fort lost 5 soldiers and 10 civilians, with dozens wounded, while the Dakota suffered at least 50 casualties, a significant blow to their fighting force. Anderson notes that the battle, though a defensive triumph, was not decisive, as the Dakota remained a formidable threat. Fort Ridgely, a fragile bulwark, stood as a symbol of resistance, its defenders bloodied but unbowed. The war, now in its 3rd day, promised more violence. with the Dakotas' determination matched only by the settlers' desperate will to survive. As the dust settled over Fort Ridgely, the fort stood defiant, its scorched buildings and weary defenders bearing witness to a brutal struggle. The Dakota, led by Little Crow, retreated into the night, their resolve unbroken despite heavy losses. Historian Gary Clayton Anderson notes that the battle, costing the Dakota an estimated 50 warriors, marked a fleeting setback in their fight to reclaim their land and dignity. For the settlers, the victory was a fragile reprieve, bought with blood and dwindling supplies. The war's toll, from the ashes of the lower Sioux agency to the bodies at Redwood Ferry, revealed a deeper tragedy, a clash born of broken treaties and starvation. The Dakotas' courage, rooted in love for their people, echoes through history, a poignant reminder of resilience amid betrayal. Fort Ridgely's stand was but one chapter, with the frontier braced for more violence, and the wounds of 1862 etched into the land forever.